Okay, I think we're about ready to begin. I'm glad to see you all. That's encouraging that some of you are back. Um, my name is Randy Zellers again, in case you've forgotten. Just a couple of things. Please turn off your cell phones or put them in silent mode. I can take questions. We have a microphone set up here. And if you are online, you can email questions to lifelonglearning@wichita.edu. We'll have a break, approximately around 2 o'clock, about a 10-minute break. And I also must announce that you're supposed to wear face coverings while you're here, and it looks like you are. So everything's going swell so far. So, the last class, I didn't get through the entire PowerPoint, and I'm going to get through it today. If you don't happen to have that handout with you, some of you do, but if you don't happen to have it, that's all right. I'll just kind of summarize briefly what we talked about last week, which was mostly about trying to set some groundwork for understanding how to listen to the music. And I sort of put it into these categories to watch out for, namely the ensemble, which should be the easiest part to get, the rhythm, and we talked about how swing, the subdivision of the pulse into 3 instead of 2, is one of the main characteristics of the music. We talked about the harmony and how that is slightly more sophisticated, generally speaking, than maybe what went on before in classical and folk music. And what was the other one? We have, form. And form is sort of one of the key components to being able to follow a jazz song. It's also one of the trickiest to get used to. It really helps if you know the melody of the song you're listening to, because you can sort of hum it along while the improvisations are taking place, and that can help you to keep track of where you are in the music. If you also know how many measures are in the song, then you can count along and try to keep track that way. If there was a particular song you were interested in, nowadays it's real easy to get on Google and call up the music, like a lead sheet for a piece of music, so that you could actually follow it along while you were listening. And that's helpful as well. And when we look at the history of jazz, as we will find out, a lot of the changes, the different styles and creations of subgenres, all come about because different musicians had new ideas to approach those things. How to maybe change form, how to maybe look at rhythm a little bit differently, how to look at harmony differently. And I'll point those things out as we go along. Now, I received an email question over the week from someone that wanted to know, if I can paraphrase, like, how did all of that happen? How did swing become part of the rhythmic element? How did the form sort of evolve into what it is today? Because obviously there weren't some guys sitting around the table saying, "Hey, I'm bored. Let's make up a new music that will be the most important American art form in the 20th century." That did not happen. Like a lot of music, it sort of evolved. I don't know how much you know about the history of classical music, but it's kind of interesting, because how it evolved was, to begin with, it was just a melody, and that's all it was. And classical music, well, it wasn't called that then, but it served the purpose of being part of the religious ceremony. After a while, people just started to say, well, I'm bored with that. What if we actually had another group of people sing a different note? And it was a radical idea. It might seem like obvious that you could have two people sing different notes at one time, but for hundreds of years, that never occurred or never stuck with composers. And so they added a new voice. And then eventually they added more voices. And then it got to the point where so much music was being created that they had to develop a notational system, because in early um, religious classical music, it was all just memorized. And that's how the notational system came into being. So all of this stuff sort of evolved out of necessity or out of people just wanting to try new things. The chords that you would hear in a Bob Dylan song would have horrified a medieval composer. So things change, right? So, talking about jazz, it's really interesting. I'm going to give you a basic overview of the timeline of jazz, and then we're going to kind of try to answer that question about how did this evolve. So, as far as we can tell, jazz probably began sometime in the 1890s. And there's a date that's given, 1895. And there's a reason that date is given. We'll talk about that a little later. So that's the start of jazz. And not only was there this time that it started, but it started in a specific geographical location, New Orleans. And what we'll find is that New Orleans was uniquely situated. All of the right elements were there for the components of jazz to spring forth. Now, from the period of about 1895 to 1917, there was not much of a record of jazz. Jazz actually did spread out from New Orleans. The musicians would kind of go around the country and they would tour. But 1917 was when most historians say the first jazz recording was created. Now, by the time the first jazz recording had been created, the music had been around probably for around 20 years. So by the time we get our first recording, jazz has already sort of mutated into something else, and it had spread beyond New Orleans. And now the main centers for jazz at about the time of that first recording were Chicago and New York. It was in New York in particular that the idea of the big band ensemble started to get developed. Jazz became the most popular it would ever be, and probably ever will be, in the mid to late 1930s. And especially during World War II, that was when everyone listened to jazz. And it was even used as a way to boost the patriotism and the morale of troops at that time. At that time, jazz was synonymous with the big band sound, but after the war, or about the same time as the war was winding down, the big band started to die out, and smaller groups started to become the means of conveyance for this music. After World War II, there was a sort of music, a type of music that is now called bebop. And that was when jazz moved from being an almost purely entertainment type of music to a music that became self-aware as an art. And the musicians saw that what they were doing was not merely entertainment, but it could be an art form just like European classical music. The 50s is when jazz started to fracture into a lot of different substyles. So if you look at maybe pop music of the 1970s, you could see that there was country music, there was album-oriented rock, there was soft rock, there was the beginnings of heavy metal. There were all of these different types of things that kind of sprang from popular entertainment. Well, the 50s and jazz was kind of like that. So when we get to that point, we're going to talk about such things as cool jazz, third stream jazz, modal jazz, free jazz. Then in the 60s, avant-garde jazz became, well, I don't know if I would say popular, but it became one of the dominant subgenres of the music. And even while that was happening, you had the bossa nova craze of the 1960s. And then finally, in the 70s, that was when rock music like really started to take off. It had already begun in the 60s, right, with Beatlemania. But jazz and rock started to fuse together into a style called jazz rock fusion. And that's probably as far as we'll go in this course, because a lot of what happens after that, I don't want to say that nothing new happened in jazz, but a lot of what happened after that was sort of evaluations of all of these things that had come before and synthesizing with new elements. The 80s in particular was when jazz started to gain a foothold in the educational system. And yeah, that's probably about when we'll stop. But let's talk about the beginnings of jazz. Oh, let me see if I can get my clicker to work. Okay, so New Orleans. Why? Why did jazz begin in New Orleans? Well, I'll talk about this slide in a moment, but New Orleans was originally colonized by the French. And if I remember correctly, it was kind of like Australia. It was sort of like a kind of a penal colony for the French. They later control of New Orleans and Louisiana passed on to the Spanish. It went back to the French during the Napoleonic era, just for a little bit of time, and then Napoleon sold it to America. Apparently, I guess he needed the money for all of his wars and such. So because of this, there was sort of a interesting amalgamation of nationalities that were concentrated in that area. Also, New Orleans was for the longest time, one of the major centers of trade. Its position on the river, it was able to, with that position, it was able to kind of control trade for a long time, at least until like the railroads became dominant. In addition, New Orleans is geographically closer to the Caribbean islands and also to South America. So one of the reasons that jazz sprung up in New Orleans was because of this whole cosmopolitan melting pot of people: French, Spanish, Anglo-Saxons, and of course you had Africans that came, well, via many different routes. Some of them, by the time jazz was born, had been born in America. Some were still part of the slave trade. Some of them came from by way of the Caribbean islands. And in fact, some of the voodoo and mysticism that is still alive in New Orleans today came through places like Haiti and such. But here's a really big reason that it started there, and it has to do with religion. New Orleans was essentially more aligned with Catholicism as opposed to a larger area of the United States which was aligned with Protestantism. It turned out that Catholicism was far more tolerant of allowing Africans to sort of hold on to their heritage, particularly their musical heritage. In other parts of the country, that just did not happen. In fact, it was actively, Protestantism tried to actively stamp out any carryovers of African music or culture because they wanted them to assimilate. Also, there were various slave rebellions that would use musical instruments as part of their signaling system, like the drums. And so pretty much that was the end of music for them. But in New Orleans, there was an area called the Congo Square. It's now Louis Armstrong Park. And in the early 19th century, people are unsure when it ended, maybe shortly after the Civil War. On Sundays, Africans were allowed to get together and play their music and dance. And so they were able to retain all of those characteristics of the music which were being lost in other parts of the US. And some of those elements, I have some things up here that sort of try to depict maybe what music was like in the late 19th century. So from the African tradition, some of the things that carried over into jazz, we've already talked about, the cyclical form. And again, the way to think of this is that when you listen to a piece of classical music or even pop music, it has a certain structure, starts at the beginning and goes to the end. If you think of a pop song, probably it has a verse, a chorus, maybe another verse, another chorus, maybe a little bridge section, chorus, and then the song is done. What I mean by cyclical form is that it's a short amount of measures that just repeat over and over. And those could be used to create a song that can be composed like in a big band piece, or it could be really open-ended like in a jazz jam session where you just get a bunch of people and you can just play that cycle, that song over and over until everyone's like improvised as much as they wanted. That's why you can have at a jam session a jazz song that lasts 3 minutes or lasts 20 minutes because it's the same thing that gets cycled over and over. Also, an important part of African music is the idea of the polyrhythm. Now, this gets a little bit technical, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But essentially, the idea is that you can layer different rhythms on top of each other. This sort of thing is also important in the music of Brazil, for instance, where you have various rhythms that sort of interlock with each other. How that works in jazz, I've sort of intimated, where you have the bass and the drums playing a steady pulse, but then the comping instruments and the snare drum will improvise rhythms that sometimes go with the pulse or sometimes maybe rub against the pulse in a certain way. Also really important from the music of Africa is call and response. This would be easier to demonstrate musically, and I'm going to point it out when we get to it. But basically, it's the idea of you would have a person or a section of instruments play something, and then another person or section of instruments would play something musically that would almost be an answer to what was played before. And then, of course, the main thing that came from Africa is improvisation. And it's often said that jazz is sort of a mixture of European harmonies, chords, melodic concepts with African rhythms. But the improvisation is also the key factor. And it's kind of interesting, you know, when you look at European classical music, everything is composed. It's well, the classic stuff is. I mean, in today's modern classical music, you can even find elements of improvisation. But when you look at musical cultures from all over the world, there's a lot more improvisation in it. The music of India, the music of Polynesia, for example. And when you think about it, the very first music that humanity played had to have been an improvisation. And improvisation is so much a part of our lives. When you have a conversation with someone, you're improvising. So that's what it always like strikes me, that there's sort of this that improvisation in music is somewhat hard to understand, but really that's all we're doing when we go through life, is we're improvising. Classical music is perhaps analogous to us trying to put things in boxes to think that we have some sort of control over things. It gets a little bit philosophical, and I'm not making any sort of judgment call because I like it all. So also at that time, you had folk traditions and spirituals. The minstrel show was certainly an influence on popular music of the time, and this was sort of one of the dark eras of America. Minstrel shows basically started in the early 19th century, and they were kind of variety shows, jokes, music, stump speeches, but sort of what they had in common was they were white performers that dressed as black people and tried to lampoon Africans as being foolish and lazy and things like that. But the important thing about minstrelsy is that it evolved into the vaudeville show later on. And the vaudeville show was much less racist in general, but it's where a lot of the early blues singers came out of, and where a lot of the early jazz musicians got work. And a lot of the popular music from the era of the beginning of jazz came out of these vaudeville shows. I've read where a lot of people kind of think of the vaudeville and the minstrel shows as being an early form of TV. So, like, in other words, you would go to see these shows, and then whatever the 19th century version of the water cooler was back then, you could tell all the same jokes and things like that. I'll skip over a few of these. Dance, though, becomes really important. In fact, if you look at a lot of the early jazz records that were on the little 78 RPMs, along with the title of the song and the artist, there would also be the type of dance that the song would work with. The foxtrot, for example. Dance became very, very important in the late 19th, early 20th century. And jazz was sort of the music that accompanied it. And that's part of the reason why that music became so important. In New Orleans in particular, the brass bands were very important. You would have brass bands at weddings, at funerals. They would go around town, even advertising. You would sometimes find like groups of musicians in the back of wagons. That's why they called the trombone the tailgate trombone, because they would sit in the back of the wagon playing their trombone so they wouldn't hit anyone in the head if they were sitting somewhere else in the truck. And then we have ragtime music, which we'll talk about in a bit. So music in New Orleans was unique. It was different than anywhere else in America because you had a blending of all of these art forms, music from the Latin American areas, music from Africa, the popular music of the day that came via the minstrel shows and vaudeville, brass band music like march music. Think of John Philip Sousa, who was really popular during the time when jazz became popular. So, and that's what all of that is. And the other thing I will mention is that there was another class of people in New Orleans called the Creoles of Color. And they were essentially mixed race, usually French or Spanish, who had a black wife or perhaps even a mistress. And for most of their time in New Orleans, Creoles of color had a pretty high social status. New Orleans was, I think, maybe the only place in America during the 19th century that had two symphonies, a white symphony and a symphony that consisted of Creoles of color. The Creoles had good trades, like a lot of them were cobblers or carpenters. They could make a good living, and they were also very interested in music and were particularly attuned towards European classical music. One thing that happened during the end of the 19th century is that New Orleans sort of lost its trade power. I had mentioned earlier that railroads started getting built, and that kind of took a lot of trade away from New Orleans. In addition to that, New Orleans was where the famous Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson got started, which was the separate but equal clause. And that was decided basically because a Creole wanted to, just sit on the bus just like everyone else, and he didn't go to the bus that he should have. But unfortunately, because of that decision, the Creoles started to lose their status, and the Creole musicians then were sort of forced to start playing gigs with the African Americans in town who were a bit more rough and tumble, not aligned towards the European system of music. So you had this interesting sort of synthesis then where the Creoles learned improvisation from the African Americans, and the African Americans maybe learned more about European music and sort of a more sort of more technical aspects of the music. So they became better. Each one of them became better musicians because of that. All right. So, Buddy Bolden. I don't know how well you can see this photograph. It's the only photograph we have of this fellow. Buddy Bolden is standing next to the bass player, so he would be whatever that is, second from the left. He was a cornet player. And a lot of people attribute the beginning of jazz to this fellow. We have no recordings of him. In fact, the main reason that we know anything about him is that what happened was I mentioned that in the mid 40s, a music called bebop occurred that was this very sort of self-aware artistic movement. Well, as with a lot of things in art, there was a rebellion against that. A lot of people thought that bebop was terrible. It was the wrong way to go. So there was actually sort of a resurgence of the original New Orleans jazz music during this time. And it turned out that a lot of the original musicians from this time period were still alive in the late 40s, early 50s. So they were able then to go back and talk to them and say, okay, well, what was it like back then? Who were the people that started this? And most of them would say that Buddy Bolden was the guy. Supposedly, he had some really interesting innovations as far as to how rhythm was approached in jazz, and almost everyone agrees that he was the first one, maybe if not to improvise, but the first one that developed a sound that was sort of signature to him. We'll probably never know. I mean, I don't see there's any way. There's recordings of him, and here's why. I mentioned that the first jazz recording was made in 1917. Well, unfortunately, he was committed to a state asylum like 10 years before that. He started just working as a plasterer and began playing the cornet in his teens. And here's why a lot of people think jazz started in 1895, because that's when Buddy Bolden started playing gigs. So there's the answer to that. Apparently, like, he became one of the major figures in New Orleans music. Kids would like hang outside of his apartment and just listen to him practice all day, or so the story goes anyway. But like so many early jazz musicians, there were a few of them, he had kind of a drinking problem, and that caused him issues, and then eventually he developed schizophrenia. The story goes is that he was playing a gig in a marching band, and he would just kind of walked out and just kept on going, and people had a hard time communicating with him after that. He would just keep talking to himself and just not really be aware of what was going on. So he was committed to a state asylum, and he died in 1931. No one even at that time would have remembered him other than the musicians that would have played with him. And it's only now that we kind of know of his contribution. So the New Orleans style of jazz, sometimes this is called trad jazz, short for traditional. And it has some different approaches to melody, form, and rhythm. Now, the melodic instruments, the ensemble is quite a bit different than if you were to go to Larkspur and listen to a band today. The most typical ensemble consisted of the melodic line of cornets, clarinets, and trombones, one of each. Then the harmony instruments could be a piano. The banjo is often present. The banjo is an instrument that essentially came directly from Africa and was modified a bit once it got here. The drums were sometimes present, but not always. And what always interests me about early jazz is that the bass sometimes was not there in the early ensembles. And what would happen is if there was a bass line, it would be played by the piano. Now, why these instruments? Well, it turned out that after the Civil War, I guess this really happened, is like a lot of the people that played musical instruments in the bands in Civil War, once it was over, they just dropped their instruments on the ground and went home. So a lot of these instruments were the ones that would show up in shops and pawn shops, and you would be readily accessible to musicians, particularly poor musicians at that time. So again, it's just sort of an interesting coincidence of events that the ensemble grew out of that sort of necessity, just having those instruments around and having access to them. So I've also written on this sheet some substitutions that you would often see. The saxophone was not near as popular in early jazz as it is now, but you would sometimes find it. When there was bass present, it was often played by the tuba. String bass, not so much. I have some pretty cool recordings of some New Orleans jazz bands that were using string bass in the mid 20s, but not a whole lot. And one of my favorite groups, there was a violinist from New York named Joe Venuti. And he would often play in a group that had a bass saxophone. And I might have mentioned this last time. They're huge things. They like stand as tall as a person. You can do an image search. They're pretty cool. And they sound awesome. So this is kind of what a typical New Orleans combo would look like. Again, there are tons of variations on this. This was one of Louis Armstrong's most important groups. You can see trombone, cornet, clarinet, and piano and banjo. And I think I showed you a picture last time that's what a drum set looked like around that time. So that was the ensemble. The form was a bit different too, because like I talked about last time, the blues is an important form that everyone followed. Also, the song form, the 32-bar song form, written by Tin Pan Alley composers for musicals and vaudeville and such. But what was also important was the march and ragtime music. And those particular types of music used a much interesting form. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but it had like often 4 or maybe even more different sections to it. Probably the most striking thing about New Orleans music was the collective improvisation part. And you won't be able to miss it. It's basically where everyone is playing at the same time. So if you hear that, that's going to be your biggest clue that you're listening to New Orleans music. That and perhaps the sound quality of the early recordings. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I'd like to play for you a ragtime piece. Now, ragtime became one of the most popular forms of music in the early 20th century. The first ragtime composition, the sheet music, was published in 1897. And because of more coincidences, ragtime was sort of synonymous with the manufacture of pianos, an explosion of piano manufacturing. Everyone wanted to have a piano. And in 1897, along with the first publication of ragtime music, also came the first demonstration of a working pneumatic player piano. So all of this combined to make ragtime one of the most important elements. Ragtime was a piano music that was basically centered around Missouri. The important composers were from there. And when you listen to it, there's a couple of things that characterize it. You can hear a definite rhythm in the left hand that alternates between bass and chords. And then the right hand often plays melodies which are highly syncopated. Syncopation is an important rhythmic element of jazz. And what it means simply as I can put it, is that you're often giving stress to parts of a measure or a beat that would normally be weak in other forms of music. So in other words, if you're tapping your foot, you get lots of notes that come when your foot's off the floor. Ba, da, ba. You'll hear all of this. But look at the form to this tune. When you listen to it, you can think of these letters as being the new themes or the new melodies that come through in the music. So we have an A melody that is played twice, then a contrasting B melody that's played twice. Then they go back to the A once. And then we have two whole nother thematic elements that are placed at the end. You've probably all heard this song, but let's give it a listen because it's just great fun. Here we go, I hope. So this is the second A. What you heard was the first. This is the new theme, B. Played again. Back to the original theme. Then we get new material. Can you hear that bone? And here's the final new bit. Okay, so jazz has always kind of been influenced by whatever music is happening around it. And so early jazz was influenced by ragtime a lot. And so they would actually play songs that had those sorts of forms. You typically do not find that in other styles of jazz. So that's a big clue to you that you're listening to early jazz is when you hear things like that. John Philip Sousa marches also had a very similar sort of formal structure where it would have different sections like that. So, the rhythmic part of New Orleans style. So we've sort of looked at the ensemble and the form, the rhythm. What you're going to find in the rhythm is that it basically followed a march pattern, a 2-beat pattern, kind of like the ragtime did. 1, 2, 1, 2, right? That's a march style pattern because we have 2 feet. And so that's what the march rhythm is basically a 2-beat feel. What you'll find in later jazz, especially in jazz of the swing era, is that that's going to switch to a 4-beat thing. But we'll talk about that when we get there. So now we're going to listen to some early jazz so we can hopefully put all of this in context. So the first recording was made by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. They were from New Orleans. Interestingly enough, they were entirely white. So that is kind of a shock, since most people would agree this music was created by African Americans. The story goes, though, is that they asked a fellow named Freddie Keppard, an African American, to record his group before they did this band, but he was afraid that everyone would steal his licks, so he declined. So the very first recording we have is from these fellows, and I mean it's pretty good. It gives you a pretty good idea of what the music sounded like. And that wasn't the only important part of this band. Prior to making this recording, they had done some touring. And in 1917, they had gone to New York, which was part of the impetus for them doing this first recording. And so that was important because their popularity helped make the spread of jazz continental. So we're going to listen to this. This is it. This is the very first jazz recording. Some people will dispute it, but this is it. And what you're going to find is it's kind of interesting. It's a mixture of a ragtime multi-sectional thing where you have different thematic elements. You can see it at the bottom: A, B, B, C, C, A, B, C, C. The C sections are easy to recognize because they make animal sounds. But each one of those sections is actually a 12-bar blues. So other than the 4-bar intro, that's what you're going to hear is a lot of 12-bar blues choruses strung together with different themes. So here it is, the very first jazz recording. First A. And it repeats. So this should feel like a march, kind of. Here's B. B again. Okay. So this is the original A section. Or that was the B, that's the C. Okay, so there it was. What's kind of nice about this era is that all the songs are short. Recording technology was really in its infancy, and the other side of it, which is maybe not so good, is these recordings just sound horrible. There's not a lot you can do to fix them. Part of the reason is because of this. This was how a lot of early recordings were done. There was that horn looking thing that everyone played into, and then that would be attached to a stylus that would etch into whatever the medium was, the shellac. So there was no the only way you could you could balance the instruments out was by setting them at the appropriate distance proportional to their volume. So the drums you usually had to sit way in the back of the room. In fact, that's one of the reasons you can't hear the drums really well on these early recordings, because if they played too loud, it would cause the stylus to bounce and you'd ruin the take. As a result, a lot of times the drummers would play with like brushes and things like that. So yeah, the recording qualities aren't good, but I like it. It's kind of quaint. It's nice. Freddie Keppard. So this is the fellow that got the chance to make the first jazz recording, but declined. There are recordings of him playing later. I haven't really included any. Most of his contemporaries said that his early playing was a lot like Buddy Bolden's, but that as he got older, at the point we have recordings of him, his playing really wasn't all that great. He suffered from alcoholism, and his playing just wasn't too super when there were recordings to be made. He is credited by his contemporaries as kind of being the one that established the standard small group New Orleans orchestra, which we've talked about. Basically, clarinet, cornet, trombone, piano and banjo, or piano and drums. He was also one of the musicians that toured early. I've noted here that by 1911, he had already played in California, Chicago, and New York. So again, this music had spread before we ever got the first recording. Joe King Oliver. By the way, all of these musicians that we're talking about are or were New Orleans musicians. Joe Oliver was the only one that wasn't born right in New Orleans. He was born in a small town just north of New Orleans. He's important for a lot of things. He was a pioneer in the use of horn mutes, which we'll talk about later, but basically mute started as like taking a sink or a toilet plunger and taking the head and putting it over the bell of the trumpet. And by doing things like this, you could create these interesting sounds. You'll get to hear a lot of that later on. He moved to Chicago in 1918. Now, this is sort of an important thing because lots of New Orleans musicians, either before the time of the first recording or shortly after, moved north to Chicago. And this is part of an historical event called the Great Migration. It was when a lot of African Americans from the South moved north to procure better jobs, better paying jobs, and of course not to put up with the sort of virulent racism that was then all through the South. So one of his problems, though, was that he loved sugar and he ate sweets all the time. And he ended up sort of developing some gum problems. And so he couldn't play all the time as well as he would have liked. So one of the most important events in early jazz is that he called down to New Orleans, and one of his former students was Louis Armstrong. And he said, "Hey, come on up to Chicago and play in my band, and we'll have 2 cornets in this group, and you can take all the hard parts, and when I'm feeling like I can't play very well, you can take over for me." So I'd like to play you a tune of his. Now, this is an example of the ragtime sort of element creeping into jazz, and you can see that this kind of has one of these weird forms. A, B, B, A, C, C, C. And this form is really hard to follow, so don't worry if you can't follow it. I just kind of want to I'm trying to give you kind of the idea of what this music sounded like. And this is this recording is a little tricky to listen to. It's pretty scratchy, but there's some good playing on it, and it's a really neat tune. It's called The Snake Rag, and I think you'll be able to hear why it's called that. That's the snake. I'm sure you figured it out. So here's the C section, the ending. All right. That's party music in the 1920s anyway. So presumably you've heard, maybe you've grown accustomed now to this idea of collective improvisation. It's like where everyone is kind of soloing at once, and it seems a bit chaotic. There is sort of a method to the madness, though. Typically what happens is the cornet part plays a melodic figure, the melody of the song. Oftentimes, especially in these old recordings, it's really buried and hard to pick out. The clarinet then improvises over the top of that. So you can think of this like a 3-layer thing happening. So the clarinet's playing all this fancy, the cornets are playing the melody. And what the trombone typically does is play longer notes, often sliding between them, that sort of comic glissando sound. And those notes are just important parts of the chord. So it serves to provide the listener with the sound of the chords moving from one to the other. But yeah, it can sound a little bit like a mess at times. I think we're about coming on a break. I've got a few more things I want to play for you, but how about if we take a 10-minute break and we're going to finish up New Orleans and then get into some big band music. Thank you. All right, I'll be starting in a minute. I've got my coffee. Thank you to the nice coffee person. All right, so I had a few more important early musicians I wanted to get through with New Orleans music, and this fellow is one of the most interesting and one of the most important. Jelly Roll Morton. His parents did not name him Jelly Roll. His name is Ferdinand Joseph Lamoth. He was one of the Creoles of color in New Orleans, and I have written here, considered the earliest jazz composer of significance. So someone on the break asked me a question, well, how do they know what melody they're playing? Well, there's really kind of two types of melodies they played. They either would have like written their own tunes, or they would have played a melody from a popular song from the day. And Jelly Roll Morton wrote a lot of interesting songs, but what is really important about him is how he kind of arranged the songs. When you listen to them, you're not only hearing like the movement from distinctive parts like melodies, you know, this section is one melody, this section is another melody. It's how he sets all of his melodies as well. The arrangements of the songs, who plays what when, counter melodies and things like that. Very colorful character. He was disowned by his parents because they found out that he was sneaking out to play piano in the bordellos of Storyville in New Orleans. Storyville was kind of a famous red light district, and a lot of importance has been placed on Storyville as being one of the places where jazz was born. But apparently, a lot of the contemporary musicians of that time think that it was kind of blown up propaganda, like a way to sell the story that there were gigs everywhere. It just wasn't in the red light district. But Jelly Roll Morton did play piano in Storyville. You could see he actually took jazz to Canada and Alaska and Mexico. Like Joe Oliver, he moved to Chicago, and his most important recordings were with a band called Jelly Roll Morton and his Red Hot Peppers. He was a guy that liked to his idea of self promotion was really kind of interesting. Like just a couple of things about him. He in one of his teeth, he always had a diamond, and he would, wherever he went, he would haul around this big chest. And if you open this chest, it looked like it was filled with money. But actually, what it was is a little shallow tray on top of the chest filled with money, and then nothing on the bottom. But he liked to present himself as a rich dude, and he would often like change his suits 2 or 3 times a day and go about town, so that, you know, people just thought, hey man, this guy has a lot of money if he can buy all those suits. A couple of other neat little historical facts. Downbeat magazine is and has long been one of the most important periodicals about jazz music. And in 1938, he penned a famous letter that proclaimed himself the originator of jazz. No one thinks he was the originator of jazz, but he was certainly one of the main people at that time. He also recorded an interview with Alan Lomax for the Library of Congress where he talks about the early days of jazz, and he actually plays the piano and kind of demonstrates the difference between jazz and ragtime. These recordings are on YouTube. They are fascinating to listen to, and they're not very long. And I didn't put it on the listening list, but if you have time, check them out. They're really pretty cool. I'd like to play something by him. So this is from the Red Hot Peppers when he was in Chicago. And it's another sort of ragtimey form. And I hope you can see the screen because I've kind of put some just areas of note as we listen to this. So here we go. Okay. So we're almost 10 years out from the first recording. And this to me seems a lot more planned out, a lot less chaotic. There is the collective improvisation in there, but it seems like there's more of a map to what's going on. Like there are distinct solos that occur rather than everyone just playing all at the same time. Did you notice sometimes there were what were called breaks where the whole band would stop and like a musician would kind of fill in a little thing? That's something that has to be thought out in advance, typically. There was also during, I can't remember which solo, I think the clarinet solo, there were like some distinctive rhythms that the rest of the band played behind it. So this is sort of what I'm talking about when I say that it has more of a composed and arranged nature than some of the earlier New Orleans jazz. And this will become a predominant element as we get more into New York jazz with big band music, how things are a lot more planned out and you get a lot more distinctive elements like that. Sidney Bechet. This guy is considered one of the best early soloists. In fact, he was considered to be about the only guy that could hold a candle to Louis Armstrong in the early days. One of his claims to fame also was that he was one of the first people to play the soprano saxophone, which you can see that's in that picture there. It's a straight instrument like a clarinet. It doesn't have the horn to it that most of the other saxophones. And it's a very high-pitched instrument. And according to what I've heard from saxophone players, they're very hard to control to get the pitch just right. Not too many people played this instrument, and it would make a reappearance in the 60s when John Coltrane would take it up, and we'll talk about that later. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip this song, but you can look it up, and there's also some more Sidney Bechet on the listening list. I want to get to Louis Armstrong. And you may have heard him called Louis Armstrong. Supposedly, he was not a fan of being called Louis. His quote to that would be, "I'm not some French king." He wanted to be called Louis, so I'm calling him Louis Armstrong. He was very poor as a child. He was born to out of wedlock to a laborer and, by all reports, a prostitute. And for most of his early life, he lived with his grandparents. He did play cornet a little bit, but the deciding factor was in I can't remember. It was about 1913, New Year's Eve. He was arrested. He was just a kid, but he was shooting blanks into the air to celebrate the new year. So he was arrested and put in a boys' home. And frankly, this was the best thing that could have happened to him because he learned discipline there. There was a person working on staff that taught him how to play the cornet better. And in fact, when it came time for him to leave, he did not want to go. But he did. And he started his career as a musician, and he played in bands around New Orleans. He played on the riverboats up the Mississippi. And he started getting a lot more gigs as the Great Migration went into effect, and a lot of New Orleans musicians traveled north. And I already told you how Joe Oliver hired him to move to Chicago and play in his band. When he was in that band, he ended up marrying the piano player of that band. Lil Hardin was her name. And she was kind of the driving force behind Louis Armstrong's early career and got him to do things that maybe he didn't really want to do. She was the one that got him to move to New York. And that happened in 1924. And that's another important early occurrence in jazz, because when he got to New York, all of those musicians there had not heard anyone play like this guy. And they were so knocked out that he basically influenced the course of jazz soloing in New York just because of that short stay. He was there maybe not even more than a year. Then Lil Hardin convinced him to put his own group together and start recording. And these are called the Hot 5 and the Hot 7 sessions. The numbers just refer to how many musicians were in each group. They are considered to be some of the greatest small group recordings we have in jazz. And we're going to listen to some. And it's hard to put into words why he's so beloved as a jazz soloist, but when you listen to other musicians, particularly in that time period, I mean, there's no one that holds a candle. He had such a powerful tone, such a powerful range, and such a way of inventing interesting melodies and interesting rhythms in his improvisation. Hopefully, you'll just at least catch a glimpse of that as we listen. He's also known for being a singer. He has that really distinctive, raspy, growly voice, and he's often credited as being the first person to scat sing. And scat singing is a way of improvising with the vocals, but you don't sing words. You just kind of sing nonsense syllables, for lack of a better word. He was maybe not the first person to do it, but he was the one that really got notoriety for it. And we'll listen to the song that made him famous for it. The story goes is that he was reading the lyric sheet and he dropped the lyric sheet and he decided that he was just going to improvise a bunch of nonsense. And that's how it came into being. That story is probably not true. And when you listen to the recording, it sounds planned out. It doesn't sound like he dropped his music. But here's the tune. It's called Heebie Jeebies. And it's an original composition. It has kind of a complex form, but not like a ragtime tune. There's really only 3 distinctive sections to it. And most of the time, the song just goes back and forth between the first and the second section, the A and the B. So let's give a listen to Heebie Jeebies.
Come on down to that dance. They call it heebie-jeebies dance. Sweet mama, Papa got to do the heebie-jeebies dance. Got the heebie-jeebies. What you doing with the heebie? I just had to have the heebie.
All right. That was fun. I like that tune. Okay. So this was recorded a little bit later in a slightly different lineup. Lil Hart and his wife is no longer playing piano. Earl Hines is playing piano. I'll just mention this kind of briefly. Earl Hines is an important figure in the lineage of jazz piano. He was one of the first people that kind of got away from playing kind of the ragtimey sort of sound and actually trying to imitate what Louis Armstrong was doing with his right hand. In other words, playing more kind of single note solos. Great piano player. And this is just a blues. Part of the reason I want you to hear it is because the cornet playing is just amazing. Like his sound is so. The story goes is that when he played with Joe Oliver and they did recordings, he was the one they had to put on the other side of the room because his playing was so powerful and forceful that it would just overwhelm everyone. And you can definitely hear on these recordings that his instrument is a lot more present than you hear on the earlier New Orleans recordings where the cornet's always kind of covered up by the collective improvisation. But check this out. I think it's great. That was good. There's I put some more Louis Armstrong on the listening list. If you just go to Spotify, YouTube, look up Louis Armstrong's Hot 5, you will have a better day. It's just great music. So a couple more things. So now we're talking about jazz has left New Orleans. Of course, it's still going on in New Orleans, but now it's all over the country. a lot of the New Orleans musicians moved to Chicago, and the Chicago style is, we've already heard glimpses of it. The collective improvisation is becoming a little less important. There's more arrangement in the music, and there's a certain part of Chicago style jazz that is more influenced by white musicians that were influenced by all the New Orleans musicians that came up to play in Chicago. I have some things here listed that give you some ideas of the characteristics. Some important players in the Chicago style. One or two of them you probably know, or you might know. Benny Goodman was one of them. The Dorsey brothers, Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey, who had very famous big bands in the 30s and 40s, were some of them. And they kind of brought in other elements of European music. Some of these people were Italian immigrants, for example, or like would add some more sort of Jewish klezmer music that's the word I'm looking for, from the Jewish tradition into it. There was a lot less of these convoluted forms, although the song I'm going to play for you, here are some important musicians. There was this group called the Austin High School Gang, and that was a school in Chicago. And for some reason, like a lot of the important next generation white jazz players came from that high school. Benny Goodman played with the drummer Gene Krupa quite a bit. So probably besides Benny Goodman, the most important musician was this guy named Bix Beiderbecke. And boy, I like this guy's playing too. A cornet player, not the brassy sound of Louis Armstrong, more lyrical and understated, but just an amazing command of the instrument and just unbelievable melodic invention. He did not live very long. He had a pretty bad alcohol problem that kind of finished him off, unfortunately. He had a lot of problems growing up as a kid. He was sort of a truant, I guess. And his family thought they would fix it by sending him to a boarding school. Unfortunately, this boarding school was really close to Chicago, and he would skip school and get on the train and go to Chicago and listen to jazz all the time. So let's listen to a song by him. This is kind of a convoluted ragtimey type of song, but boy, there's some great playing in it. That's the interlude. All right. I like that too. So, yeah, it's becoming more compositional. You notice all these different things that sort of link parts together, the different solos together. The collective improvisation is still there, but it's becoming less and less important as we get into the late 20s. So, I think we are now going to move on. If I can figure out how to use this. Oh no. Help. Where'd my mouse go? Oh, the I, oh, is it? Oh, there it is. What? Oh, okay, I got it. Sorry, everyone. Is this the one I want? Do you have to do something? Thank you. That I kind of sprung some things on him, so that's my fault. Okay. Um, all right. So on to big bands. First of all, big bands. So in the late 20s, that's when the big band style started developing. And the ensemble itself sort of became solidified shortly thereafter. And then again, it was probably at its most popular during the World War II era, mid 30s to the early 40s. The big bands would remain popular for a while, but for various reasons, various economic reasons, it became harder and harder to keep big bands as a functioning, viable source of income for the musicians. Nowadays, big bands, their natural habitation is apparently in colleges and high schools. That's where you can hear them, which is kind of a shame. When I started my professional career in the early 90s, there were still big bands getting work around here, like often weddings or certain country club parties you could get hired to. And the way a lot of these big bands would work is you would show up and there would be like a book about that thick of music, and they were all like numbered, and the band leader would say, pull out B21, and you would have to leaf through all that music and find B21, and then you would just sight read it. And so when I played in big bands, that's how a lot of it worked. And luckily everyone was good enough to make that sort of happen. But I'd be lying if I said that we sounded as good as Count Basie or Duke Ellington or someone like that. So if you want to hear big bands, I think there is a community big band here in town. There's a Delano jazz band. And other than that, you could listen to the Wichita State University big band. Friends University has a big band. Bethel College does. So that's your chance to hear live big band music today. People still write for the big band, but mostly it's for those sorts of musicians, for high schools and big bands. I'm glad it's being kept alive, but unfortunately the nature of it is that it's just not as present as it used to be. The typical big band configuration consists of a reed section, which is most often saxophones, usually 2 altos, a tenor, and then a baritone playing the low part. Although what will often happen is all of those instruments will double on flute or clarinet. You can see that the idea here is that really it's just an expansion of a big group, except when you get enough horn players, they can play chords. So just like a piano player, you can play a 5-note chord. Well, now you can do that with the various sections of the big band. Usually 4 trombones, although 3 is not uncommon, and usually 4 trumpets. The rhythm section is just like a small group rhythm section. Bass, drums, usually piano, but sometimes, especially in the early days of big band, you would get guitar added. Which, remember, in the early days of big band, there was no electric guitar. So the guitar was this giant, they made them as big as they possibly could, and you would set the strings like an inch off the fretboard so that you could really smack that thing, and the sound of it would kind of blend in with the acoustic bass and add an extra rhythmic impulse to the music. What to listen for in big bands? Well, like a lot of what we listen to, they are based on a core song, a cyclical structure. Again, it's often a pop song, could be blues, it could be a 32-bar form, but often there are accretions to that. Like you can often have an introduction or interludes. We've already heard some of that with the small groups. You will often hear what are called block chords. Now, all a block chord is what I was talking about earlier. When you have a section of instruments, and what will happen is one of them will play the melody, and then the others below it will play a part of a chord that will go with that melody. So basically, as the melody changes, you're getting a series of chords that harmonize that melody. That's what block chords are called. And if you listen to big band music, you will hear block chords all the time. Basically, if you're hearing a melody that's harmonized in a section, you're listening to block chords. The other thing to listen to are background figures. These are often counter melodies that occur either underneath the melody or underneath an improvisation. Call and response. I alluded to this earlier as having its sort of genesis in African music, where you'll have maybe someone will play a melody, and then maybe a section of the big band will play like an answer to that. I'll point that out as we listen to some music. As a rule, most of a big band chart is composed. The improvisation happens when there is a soloist improvising, but it also happens in the rhythm section, because they're always kind of improvising their rhythm anyway. Also be aware that the leader of the band is not always the one that's like writing the music or arranging the music. A good example of that is Duke Ellington's band. When he first started that band, he was the main writer and arranger. But in the late 30s, he met a guy named Billy Strayhorn, and they would collaborate on music, and Billy Strayhorn would become the main writer of the music. So often there's that kind of hidden person behind the scenes that's actually creating a lot of the music. Do you think we could listen or watch? I have some video. Video is always more fun. Unfortunately, there was not a lot of it in the late 20s. So this is Count Basie's big band. This would have been from the early 60s, but I just want to give you an idea of where we're headed. Okay, so that's kind of where we're headed. Um, I think this might actually be a good stopping point. So, what we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about the early big bands of New York in the late 20s, and then we're going to look through the swing era. Also, there are a whole bunch of important jazz singers that got their start with big bands, and we'll listen to some of those. And then we may even have a little bit of time to look at bebop. So we'll just see what we have time for, but a lot of good music next week. So thank you all, and I hope to see you next time.